course, taking away, destroying the healthcare system failed. There hasn't been any other sort of broad domestic initiatives. Muslim ban was overturned. Now the sanctuary city money withholding is getting overturned. So everything else, all he's done is just had a bunch of signing statements where he's reintroduced pesticides that give children brain damage. He's made it easier to destroy mountains and waterways and harm public health. And of course, he's made it easier and less onerous on oil companies to bribe foreign governments. So I guess from a Republican donor perspective, it's been a relatively productive 100 days. But he needs something big and splashy because, frankly, it's just been sad and pathetic. So he has come forward, and the word out of the White House and Treasury is that there's going to be a massive tax cut package that's going to be released, and it's going to be centered around a cut on the corporate tax rate to about 15%. It's a classic trickle-down plan that's going from over 30% to around 15%. It's going to benefit shareholders. It's going to benefit the ultra-affluent. And there isn't an explanation of how this is going to be paid for yet. There's three different ways of doing this because this will explode the deficit. And we'll get to Gorge Callas, who is a senior tax counsel to Speaker Ryan, who is shockingly throwing some cold water on this. But there's three different ways to move through trickle-down fantasy, give rich people massive amounts of money tax cuts, because it will explode the deficit, which even though, as we know, Dick Cheney said behind closed doors when Bush was pushing through his own inequality tax cuts, that Reagan-proved deficits don't matter, but that's still something that Republicans like to pretend, obviously, particularly when a Democrat is president. So this will explode the deficit. So there is a border tax on imports proposal, which is something that Ryan has talked about and something that Bannon certainly supports, more of a kind of isolationist move, and may have an effect on the price of consumer goods. Then number two, there is dynamic scoring, which is what Marco Rubio is really interested in, which is basically like when a company like Enron counted as money that already existed future deals that haven't happened yet. Like, Matt and I are already multimillionaires because we've factored in, offers that are happening in 10 years. And then what you do is you just drop that into your bank account, your fantasy account, and there you go. You have it. So what dynamic scoring does is it basically is like, well, obviously dumping this money on rich people, basically even one conservative economist basically compared the plan to getting a helicopter and dropping bags of money on corporate headquarters across the country. After we do this, it's going to lead to such a spike in economic activity that, of course, it will pay for itself. And this is the old Republican trick. It's the old, trickle-down mythology. And so they'll do a dynamic score that would say this. And then the third option is, well, man, we expanded the deficit. What are we going to do? Let's make more people hungry. Let's put more lead in more homes. Let's get rid of more environmental programs. Let's get back to the main agenda here, which is mugging working people, the middle class, destroying the environment, all to subsidize engineering upward financial redistribution, which is the Republican core agenda and core brand proposition. But they're not all on the same page on this. And so far, the core problem that they have is getting this through the Senate because it will explode the deficit, and which violates the Byrd rule, so meaning it can't be passed through reconciliation. So what they would have to do is, end up passing something like the Bush cuts, which would, last for about 10 years. And, of course, do an enormous amount of social and economic damage. But this is Gorge Callas, who's an advisor to Paul Ryan. He's speaking at the Institute for International Finance in Washington, and he's throwing cold water on the proposal. This is the senior tax counsel to House Speaker Paul Ryan.
We tax people forget that people have other things to do besides worry about tax policy. I'll answer that, but let me first, I want to pick up on what Doug has said a couple of times, talking both about the constraints of reconciliation rules, as well as, Mark, you mentioning whether the White House might come out with a plan that has no offsets. And I want to, it's a very, very important point here. A plan of business tax cuts that has no offsets, to use some very esoteric language, is not a thing. It's not a real thing. And people can come up with whatever plans they want. That is not only can that not pass Congress, it cannot even begin to move through Congress day one. And there are political reasons for that. Number one, members wouldn't vote for it. But there are also statutory, procedural, legal reasons why that can't happen. Doug and Mark were both talking about reconciliation. I want to pick up on that and flesh that out a little bit, because this is very, very, very important. There is this, I call it a magic unicorn running around, and I think one of the biggest threats.
Yes, exactly. Now you have my attention, magic unicorn. Go ahead.
There is this, I call it a magic unicorn running around, and I think one of the biggest threats to the timeline on tax reform is the continued survival of magic unicorns, people saying, well, why don't we do this instead, when this is actually something that cannot be done. And as long as that exists, it's hard to move forward by getting people to go through what the speaker refers to as the stages of grief of tax reform, where you have to come to the realization that there are tough choices that have to be made, and you cannot escape those tough choices.
Now, let's be clear that Paul Ryan's not talking about tough choices in terms of not giving more money away to Exxon or Chevron shareholders. He's talking about tough choices that need to happen in conjunction with massive tax giveaways, which is his undying devotion to decimating the meager social safety net that America already has. So the play there is not, look, even from a centrist perspective or whatever we want to call it, we can't prioritize something that would explode the deficit right now with very little economic benefit. The play there is of course we want to give tax giveaways to the rich. The whole Ryan healthcare plan was a attack on healthcare for middle class and poor people to give rich people tax cuts. And the Trump plan, which I will quote now just from Talking Points memo, just to get specific on this. President Trump will unveil Wednesday a proposal to slash the corporate tax rate from 35% to 15%, a change that will balloon the federal deficit by an estimated $2 trillion over a decade. The plan will reportedly include additional cuts to the income tax rate paid by high earners and a tax rate for child care that would mostly benefit the wealthy, further costs to the federal budget. Now, again, what Ryan wants is to pass a tax plan like this, maybe even a more aggressive one, a bigger giveaway. But he needs it to happen in conjunction with destroying Medicaid, gutting Social Security, taking away what little exists of remains of food stamps and environmental regulations. Now, obviously, getting everybody on board, they couldn't even come together to get rid of health care on a massive tax giveaway and destroying the social safety net is a pretty tall order. And it kind of makes sense that Matt Drudge is putting out the poison that Paul Ryan is just waiting on Trump getting out of there and becoming exhausted. And obviously, he clearly is completely mentally and emotionally unfit for the job. Ryan sees that too. He's waiting for Trump to get out of there. And here is the Drudge tweet. He's waiting for Pence to take over. And then, they share the same agenda and they'd be able to kind of synchronize on this. But, and I'm just going to quote now again briefly actually from Jordan Weissman in Slate. And this is the specifics of why a tax plan that would explode the deficit like that cannot pass the Senate. The reasons have to do with the Senate's budget reconciliation process, which Republicans will likely have to rely on in order to move any tax bill into law, assuming Democrats won't sign on. The procedure prevents filibuster on legislation related to taxes and spending, allowing them to pass to a bare majority, but it comes with a catch. Any legislation passed through reconciliation can increase the deficit out of the 10-year budget window. This restriction, known as the Byrd Rule, is actually written into federal statute. Now, they can make the tax cuts temporary, like the Bush tax cuts. That's one possible avenue. And then just to quote briefly from Juan Wyden, Debbie Stabenow from Michigan, Democrat from Michigan, indicated that she might be willing to negotiate on corporate tax cuts, which is garbage. No Democrat should be negotiating on any of this, but she was concerned about the number. And then Ron Wyden, who is good on some surveillance and oversight issues, but certainly not particularly progressive on economics, he did say this, which was important. I want tax reform proposals that work for working families, not just for people who can hire a lot of accountants and lawyers. Today, if you're a cop or a nurse, your taxes are exemplary. They come out of your paycheck once or twice a month. No Cayman Islands for you. But if you're someone who can afford lots of lawyers and accountants, you can pretty much decide what you're going to pay, when you're going to pay, and maybe if you're going to pay any at all. And that's exactly right. So from a Democratic perspective, this should be the same as healthcare, which is completely dead on arrival. This would be, this is a massive tax giveaway to the rich right now. It would be the sort of social and economic equivalent of what the Trump administration is doing to the environment, which is essentially accelerating and deepening the crisis, which we already have a very limited time horizon to solve.
Hey, folks. The Majority Report YouTube page is in a bit of a crisis right now because of changes in their algorithms. Our YouTube revenue has been clobbered. We need your help. Just a couple of bucks a month would really help us out and keep this channel going. Head over to our Patreon page to find out more information. The URL is right here.